Welcome to the She's Just Not That Into You podcast, where we're redefining female experiences and prioritizing female perspectives. I'm Brianne.
And I'm Ji-yoon. We are two friends with global background, sharing our multicultural experiences and discussing everything that sparks our passion.
Every week, we have honest, intimate conversations that we hope will inspire and empower not only each other, but women everywhere. Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way. To be frank, the first time I met her, I wasn't even attracted to her. Right, so that's the first line of The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is the first book that we'll be discussing as part of our monthly book club.
And Han Kang is now officially the first Asian and the first Korean writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yay, it's just an amazing news. Seriously, it was the best news of the year. I was so happy that she won, and I was just so happy. It's such an incredible achievement for Asian women like us, and her books are just so incredible. They are so timely. They're so relevant. They say so much about us as humans, and especially us as women. Yeah, so we just thought that this book is just perfect for our first book club. And the Nobel Prize committee praised her for her intense poetic prose that confronts historical traumas and exposes the fragility of human life. I quoted this because when they said poetic prose, I think they really captured her character because she actually started out her career as a poet. So she still writes poetry,
Oh,
and
interesting.
she published her poetry collections as well. And I think you can really feel, how do I say, her character as a poet
Yeah.
in her novels as well. Like her work is really symbolic, poetic, and sometimes even poignant, I guess. Yeah.
And yeah, we thought it would be an interesting book for us to discuss because we felt that a lot of other podcasts that were discussing this book were actually white men. And since it's kind of a feminist book and, it's written by an Asian woman, we felt that it would be interesting for us to discuss this book as Asian women ourselves. And also, it's pretty interesting because June has read the book in both Korean and in English,
Right.
which is pretty unique. And yeah.
Yeah, oh my God, girl, we are actually the perfect duo for this episode and for this review. Yeah. And going back to the discussion of poetry, I actually have a fun fact to share with you guys. Like Korea has actually have this really unique interest in poetry, I think. Like if you walk into a bookstore in Korea, there's this whole bestseller section just for poetry collections.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't think that's something that you normally see in most other countries, like even in like France or Japan or in the States. But it's really common in Korea actually, and a lot of Koreans, including me, actually don't really realize that until we actually see it from the outside looking in and just see how special it is. And not just the bookstores, but like the subway stations in Korea, like we have poems written on the platform doors.
oh, I've seen in your Instagram stories sometimes.
Yeah. So they started having like famous poets, but now like we have like poems from citizens, and they can even submit their work to be displayed on the platforms, which is really cute, I think. Yeah, so I guess poetry has a very special meaning in Korea, and I think that's sort of reflected in Han Kang's work as well. So just to talk a little bit more about the book itself, It was first published in Korean back in 2007. It was based on her short story that she wrote back in 1997. It was called The Third of My Woman, but it wasn't until it was translated into English by Deborah Smith in 2015 that it became really popular outside of Korea as well. Then it won the 2016 Man Booker International Prize, which made The Vegetarian the very first book to win the prize after it stopped being awarded to an author's entire body of work and began to be awarded instead to single novels or short story collections. And I think that's about enough for the history. So let's jump into the discussion.
Yeah, so I just wanted to briefly summarize the book structure. So it's actually a pretty short novel by English standards. I
Right.
feel like novels written in English tend to be pretty long, but this one is pretty short. It's under 200 pages, so it's pretty short.
Right.
And it's divided into three sections. The first section is told from the point of view of the main character, the vegetarian's husband. The second section is told from the point of view of the main character's older sister's husband.
Mm-hmm.
And the third part is told from the point of view of the main character's sister.
Right.
So, June, why did you think it took so long for a Korean writer to win the Nobel Prize in literature? And what do you think was so special about Han Kang that made her the first Korean writer to do so?
Okay. So one thing, I think it's about power dynamics. Like Korea wasn't always a powerful country, you know. There was a time when it was super poor, when it wasn't a strong country, like when it wasn't strong enough to be considered for something like a Nobel Prize. But even now, I mean, after it became one of the most powerful countries in the world, I feel like Korean literature is still pretty underrepresented. And another thing, and it ties into the fact that it's hard to be translated, is that the Korean language is so rich in its adjectives and it's incredibly descriptive. You know, it's so nuanced, and we have all those specific words to describe like subtle emotions, relationships, or even like different levels of politeness depending on who you're talking to. They're so naturally like related, like they're so intertwined into the way we speak and write in Korean. So it's really hard to translate Korean into other languages that are relatively not. And it's really hard to just, you know, have these contextual details translated into like English, French, like Spanish, or just whatever language out there. And the last thing that I think is super tricky is all the sound based expressions we use.
Right.
Like we have these little words to describe like sounds, movement, or even feelings. For example, like instead of just saying the rain is falling, like it's raining, we'll add a sound like juruk juruk, like which actually mimics how it feels and how it sounds, like the sounds of raining. So there are so many of these and they're so specific. So it's honestly impossible to translate some of them into other languages without losing the meaning. Like it's just impossible to do justice to these expressions. So yeah, these are the basically the biggest reasons why it's been so hard for like, you know, like the Korean writers to be awarded the Nobel Prize. And so naturally, there's a lot lost in translation for these reasons.
Right. Yeah, I feel like having done some research behind this book and how it became so popular internationally, it feels like the fact that it was able to find a good translator
Right.
who was really passionate about kind of introducing this book to a Western audience was, you know, a really big reason why it became so
Right.
popular. And I actually even read online that there's just such a small percentage, I think it's like 3% of books published every year in English speaking countries are translations, which is such a tiny number. You know, if you compare it
Really
with,
tiny number.
yeah, for example, in Japan, I'd say like it's probably, I haven't looked it up, but it's probably like a pretty large percentage of books that are read in Japan
Right.
translated into Japanese from other languages. But yeah, it does seem like English speakers have a reluctance to engage with texts that have been translated into English from other
Mm-hmm.
languages. And even more so, so like this small statistic of 3%, most of them are actually books that have been translated into English from European languages. So when it comes to, yeah, East Asian languages, that's like even smaller. So this book it really seems like a kind of miracle that it was able to be
It is
translated.
actually.
Yeah.
Right.
That it got to be translated into
Mm-hmm.
English and gained popularity. Yeah.
Right. And you know, I read the book both in English and in Korean, and I actually have pretty conflicted feelings about the translation because I thought it was really good overall, but it felt more creative than I expected.
Mm,
I mean, I totally agree that translation is also a creative process. And I get that the goal of translation is to make translated texts have the same impact as the original, right? But honestly, when I read Deborah Smith's translation, it feels a little different to me. Like, for example, when I read the original, there are lines that just hit, you know?
yeah.
Like when I read a sentence and I think, wow, that's such a great sentence, or what an amazing expression. And
Right.
I feel like these lines should have the same impact. But when I read a translation, the lines that stood out to me in the original don't always have the same impact. Sometimes the lines that felt really powerful in the original feel kind of
Oh,
flat in the translation.
right.
But then, interestingly, there are lines that were kind of, just okay in the original, but in our translation, they work so much better and feel really strong. So, yeah, it's sort of a mixed feeling.
Yeah, actually, I think I read or heard somewhere that the first line that I just read out at the beginning of this episode, I heard that
Hmm.
in Korean it's actually pretty different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great opening, but not because it's like super creative or like mind blowing, but because it is the kind of thought someone just keep to themselves, you know? So it's like we're getting into this really transparent glimpse into someone's mind. And I think cultural elements play a big role in how it lends to, because I heard that it has such a powerful impact in English.
Yeah, in English it's like hilarious, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah, I
yeah.
did read that the English translation of the book had come under some criticism for being more kind of fancy than the
Yeah.
original, which
Mhm.
is I read was very it's like very sparse and simple.
Yeah. Right, right, right. And a lot of Han Kang's expressions and words are super poetic, but in the translation, there are parts where it doesn't quite feel the same as in the original. That's where it gets a little lost in translation. But honestly, I'm just really glad that it works so well in the international market. That definitely made a huge difference.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because I don't know if you looked up the background, but Deborah Smith only started learning Korean like a couple of years before she
Like 6 years
translated.
or something, which is super crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's not Korean, right?
She's British, like the fully
Yes.
British, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not
Yeah.
even like she's a Korean who speaks English or like
Right, right.
anything like that, right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
crazy. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely not my place to make any criticisms on this English translation, but I would say that if there was one thing that I found a bit strange about the English translation was that I mean, obviously, because the translator, Deborah Smith, is British. And I did feel like the book did feature some very specifically British expressions and ways of saying things. For
Mm,
example, it said lift instead of elevator. And there was this one line where one of the characters asked another character, "Do you fancy a cup of coffee?"
mm-hmm.
Instead of, "Do you want a cup of
Right.
coffee?"
Fancy is such a British word.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt like that was quite interesting because I felt like, for example, an American reader might end up kind of accidentally picking up a slightly British flavor when reading this
Right.
English
Yeah.
translation, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of is obviously not there in the original Korean text. So I don't know, if I were to change something about the translation in English, I would say that maybe it should have been translated into a more standardized
Mm-hmm.
English.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe using words like elevator, or yeah, like, "Do you want a cup
Right.
of coffee?" instead of "fancy a cup of coffee?"
Right.
Which kind of transplanted me into a very British context.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we should talk about the feminist aspects of this book first, right?
Let's do it. Yeah. So I really think the book is a deeply feminist text. It's all about the violence women face, not just the loud, obvious kind, but also the quiet, subtle, and insidious ways it shows up in everyday life. It's not just about her deciding to become a vegetarian. It's about how these layers of violence are tied into the fabric of her daily reality, right? Sometimes it's just as simple, but as infuriating as people refusing to actually listen to her. Like they don't see her as a whole person. Like in the novel, for example, Yeong-hye, she keeps saying that her dreams made her stop eating meat. But does anyone in the novel actually stop to ask what those dreams mean to her or even how she's feeling? No, like it really drives me up the wall. No, it's not the right expression. It makes me feel powerless because no one takes the time to understand her. Not her husband, not her family, not even her own parents. Instead of caring about her as a person, they just jump straight into trying to control her body, her choices, her life, and everything. And honestly, that's what makes us deeply feminist. It shows the reality, it's just all there.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the main character doesn't have a point of view in this novel.
Mm-hmm.
Like the book is about Young-hae, but we never get to hear her opinions or her thoughts or anything.
Right.
Her story's
That's
just
the
told.
reality itself.
Yeah, her story's just told by the people around her. And it's so interesting that, as you said, it's a deeply feminist story, but it's told from the point of view of the men around her, I guess, until the final chapter, which is told from the point of view of the sister.
Right. And there is actually this really one heartbreaking line in the novel where Young-ha says, and I'm quoting her here, "No one can understand me. The doctors, the nurses, they're all the same. They just force me to take medication and stab me with needles." And I think that's exactly what the novel wants to talk about. Like, nobody tries to understand what we say as women. And that line hit me really hard and it feels so relevant. Like, as women, we are always dismissed and ignored. When we speak up, we are ignored. And it's like the whole world is like in this cycle of doubting everything women say. And I think the novel really speaks to that reality. And I think the structure adds another layer to the message and to the book. Like the book is told from the perspectives of other characters. Never Young-hae herself. And this whole structure mirrors how society views women. Like everyone has an opinion about Young-hae, but no one truly sees her the way she is. So through their observations, like we end up learning more about the narrators than we do about Young-hae herself. So I think it really tells how people project their biases and judgment onto women or anyone they don't understand really. So it's basically Han Kang holding up a mirror to society almost. We think we're learning about the other when we talk about them, but it's actually all about who we are and we are seeing ourselves in it.
Yeah.
Like, because people love to talk about women all the time, like what we wear, how we act, and what we should do or what we shouldn't do. But everything that says so much more about the people doing the talking than it does about us women. So
Yeah, that's so true. And so, yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you, do you think that she is actually mad? Because I guess the novel, it's a story about her having mental illness. But
yeah.
do you think she actually is mentally ill? Because there are times when it actually seems like she's a lot more sane than some of the other characters, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I honestly feel like the male characters, they are the one who need to be hospitalized.
Yeah. So, firstly, yeah, I think it's really interesting because to me, like, this novel is pretty similar to the book Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which is
Right,
another Korean feminist novel
right,
written by another Korean female
right,
author called Cho Nam-ju. And in that book, the main character, Kim Ji-young, actually becomes mentally ill through all the suffering that is inflicted upon her by society and by the men
right,
around her. And this seems pretty similar to that. And I do feel also that
right,
if Yeong-hye actually is mentally ill, this novel kind of makes it seem like her mental illness is caused by the men around her, especially her male family members. Because, for example, there's the pivotal scene where her dad is force feeding her
oh my
meat and
god,
becoming aggressive, and that's the point where she becomes suicidal, right? Because until
right.
then she wasn't suicidal.
And even the doctor is portrayed as violent and really controlling, but somehow society paints Young-hye as the one who's out of control and mentally ill, the crazy one, right?
Yeah, so the one line that I thought was pretty crazy was in the first chapter, which is told from the point of view of Young-hae's husband. He says, "The fatherly affection that was almost choking the old man made a powerful impression on me, and I was moved to tears in spite of myself." Which is so crazy because this so-called fatherly affection was literally when Young-hae's father was like kind of violently attacking her and forcing
Right.
her to eat meat. And this
Mm-hmm.
makes her husband feel impressed, and he's moved to tears
Right.
because he thinks that this is kind of what like the way that men are meant to show love
Right,
towards
right,
women,
right.
which is
Yeah.
so interesting because it's kind of it reminds me of the episode we did last week with Sarah Abdu, where she said that in Bolivian society there's this problem of men being violent towards women and it kind of being the social norm. And she was saying that there was that phrase that they use, which is me pega porque me quiere, which means like he hits me because he loves me. And yeah, it's the kind of thing of kind of male violence being seen as an act of love,
Right.
while women having any kind of agency is seen as kind of something very transgressive.
And is
And
mentally ill.
yeah.
And it's just
um
crazy to think about. I mean, a lot of the time when men go crazy, they harm other people, right? They
yeah,
either hit women or kill women or do whatever crazy thing to other people, right? But
yeah.
when a woman goes crazy, she just decides to go vegetarian.
Yeah.
And she never harms anyone else,
Yeah.
and that's very realistic, I think. And there is actually this line from our sister Inhe that really stuck with me. So in the book she says, "It's your body, you can treat it however you please, the only area where you're free to do just as you like." but then
Yeah.
but then she still cannot do anything about it. Even that freedom just doesn't exist for women.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
but for me, I think it's really interesting that it's almost like the men in this novel seem to have very little control over their own bodies. And it's almost like they're kind of maybe it's like they're jealous of Young Hae that she is able to kind of try to assert this control over her own body. Because also, for example, the majority of the sex in this novel is completely non-consensual, and it seems like it's like the men seem to have no control over their own impulses, and they're like behaving like animals, and like there's so many scenes where there's like a husband who's raping his wife, and it's almost like he doesn't have any control over himself, and he can't help but do it. And then there was also the line that really stuck with me was when Yeong-hye's sister's husband seems to be going crazy over this Mongolian mark that
Right.
Yeong-hye has on her bum. And there was this really funny line. It said, the month she'd spent with them before moving out into a rented studio apartment had caused none of them even the slightest strain. Partly this was because he had yet to hear about the Mongolian mark. It's just so funny that like just hearing about this Mongolian mark is such a big
Right.
deal that it tips him over the edge and he's unable to like control himself.
Right.
It's like he is the one who's crazy in this.
Yeah, he has such an eccentric taste in that, like in that sort of area.
Yeah, and yeah, it's like a lot of the men in this novel are not able to kind of be in control of their bodies, right? And
Hmm.
then, but at the same time, they're trying to control the women's bodies.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
And even kind of, well, I mean, the doctor, I don't know about his own personal like relationship with his own body, but he definitely seems to be kind of in a position of trying to control people's bodies, because I think there was this one line where it said that he was kind of upset that there were patients who didn't live up to his expectations of like getting better, and
Right. And he
yeah,
was
that
so
kind of
mad
thing.
about that, and he
Yeah.
was like so determined to fix Young-hae, and and he became really violent.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He was basically just like her father, right?
Yeah. They're basically the same character, like the same symbol in the novel.
So, speaking of this, do you think that anything in this book is specific to Korean culture and needs to be read based on that, or do you think it's more universal?
Well, to be honest, I think it was very universal. Like the theme of violence, the realities and everything, like the themes, like the topics like autonomy, violence, and societal expectations and stuff like that is universal. But at the same time, I think it's deeply rooted in Korean culture context as well. Like, for example, the pressure Young-hae faces to conform, especially from her family. I think it reflects the importance of collective responsibility, or like the harmony, or like filial piety, and the violent reactions to her decision to become vegetarian. But at the same time, I think it's important to think about the fact that the novel was originally published in 2007, which is pretty long time ago actually. And I feel like back then, even in the West, I think becoming a vegetarian was a lot more radical than right now. So I
Yeah,
guess it was
and
even more radical in Korea.
yeah, and not only is she vegetarian, but she's actually vegan because she doesn't eat
Yeah,
eggs
yeah, she's
or
vegan, right?
yeah, dairy products, and she doesn't use leather shoes. I don't know what the word is in Korean. Is there like a separate word for vegetarian or vegan, and which one is actually used in the book?
In the book, it says vegetarian, like in Korean, in the original
Oh,
text.
okay. So there's
Yeah,
no kind of way to
like there's no
differentiate
like
between.
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, for me, like, I felt like the whole thing about vegetarianism seemed to be maybe a commentary on the kind of collectivist culture and pressure to conform. I guess not only in South Korean society, but also in Japanese society as well. I feel like there's a lot of pressure for people to conform to like what other people are doing, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like also my own personal experiences in Japan as someone who has dietary requirements is that it seems to be there seems to be less awareness here than there is, in the UK, for example, about people who have different diets. And
Right.
so in that sense, it does seem like it is quite kind of familiar to see these scenes where people think that being a vegetarian is something really weird or strange to do, but at the same time I do feel that maybe do you think maybe this book does kind of use this vegetarianism as a symbol for kind of just anything that someone does that's slightly against the norm is kind of blown way out of proportion. Because I remember, like, in the part where it's the husband's point of view, he says it seemed like more than a simple case of vegetarianism. Like, the way it is written like that, it seems like being a vegetarian is some kind of like dangerous disease.
Yeah.
um, and then there was also another line that said her husband had decided that her vegetarianism was proof that she would never be normal again.
Oh my god.
And it's and then the fact that she becomes vegetarian is the thing that makes her husband want to get divorced, right?
Yeah.
Which is so crazy, right?
But I can totally imagine, like, still now, I guess there are some men out there who would consider like divorcing their wives just because, if they turn vegetarian.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend here in Japan who said that his cousin, who's also Japanese, recently decided to become, I think it was either vegetarian or vegan, but apparently his family reacted really badly and
Right.
acted like they were super worried that
Yeah.
he's going crazy or something.
Wow.
Yeah, speaking of this kind of pressure in Korean society and also, I guess, Japanese society, this pressure to conform, I felt like this book kind of reminded me a lot of Haruki Murakami's novels as well.
Right.
Yeah, in a lot of Murakami's works, I feel like there are a lot of transgressive characters who don't live according to social norms. And I guess maybe, do you think the fact that I remember you were telling me before that Korean society is very kind of homogenous and kind of claustrophobic, and people care a lot about what other people are doing. Do you think this book is kind of commenting on that as well?
I mean, yeah, I think that kind of social pressure and non-conformity to that societal expectations, like the idea of non-conformity being really weird and crazy, is reflected in the male characters and how they react to Yeong-hye being a vegetarian. I think most of the aspects in the book, they are really symbolic. Not only do they talk about Korean society, they also talk about something really universal, I think. Like, not just the violence in Korea or violence against women or, something. I think they are basically talking about how it is inescapable in reality.
Yeah, I think we both have a lot of things that we want to say about the universal aspects of
Mm-hmm.
book. Before we get on to that, I actually wanted to ask you another question related to this topic, which is that what do you think is the perception of mental illness in Korea? Because in this novel, I found it interesting how Yeong-hye's family kind of all cut ties with her when she goes to the psychiatric hospital, and they seem to not
Right.
want to have anything to do with her. And actually on Netflix, I watched the Korean drama called It's Okay to Not Be Okay, which
Mm-hmm.
is set in a psychiatric hospital. And that drama also made me feel like mental illness is kind of something that's considered shameful, or even that people find it shameful if they have family members who are mentally ill.
I think definitely people are getting more and more aware that mental illness is something that shouldn't be stigmatized, and it's improving. Like, the awareness is improving in Korea as well. And I think it's important to note again that the novel was written in 2007. I guess that's when everything was a lot more crazy when it comes to mental illness and awareness around that. And I guess at that time it was even more crazy to see someone, getting therapy, like seeing therapists and stuff like that. And historically, it's been seen as something shameful. And many families, I guess, would hide or avoid addressing it to preserve their reputation, I guess, even if they have some like mental issues or something like that. So in the novel, like, Young has family's reaction, like cutting ties when she's admitted to the hospital, like, I think it really echoes this societal tendency to distance themselves from this kind of shame.
It's interesting because yeah, on one hand it seems like it's almost like the family members or the people around Yeong-hye seem to be almost kind of punished by society for being related
Right.
to her, because I was really struck by this line that said the scandal hanging over her relating to In-hae, like as if In-hae's sister being admitted to hospital is a scandal that's hanging over In-hae, when it's not In-hae's fault. It's not even really anything
Right.
to do with her. It's her sister, but she's still got this scandal hanging over her.
Mm-hmm.
And then Young-hae's husband also says, anyone can see that I'm the real victim here, when he
Yeah.
divorced her. As if, he cares
So
so much.
typical.
He cares so much about his own reputation.
Yeah, definitely.
But then at the same time, it's interesting that this kind of thing would even be something bad for his reputation. Well, I mean, it actually probably is partly his fault that she went insane, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's interpreting it that way.
Right.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, I do feel like in this novel, in this sense, is pretty similar to the drama It's Okay to Not Be Okay as well, in that in this novel I feel like being mentally ill is also seen as something kind of liberating, because it means that you don't have to follow social norms. You're kind of
Mm-hmm.
excused from having to conform.
Right.
And there was this line where In-hae says she'd been unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Young-hae to shock off social constraints and leave her behind still a prisoner. Yeah, that was a pretty
That's a great line.
yeah, it was a pretty kind of scary to
Mm,
imagine this
right.
society as being like a prison, right?
But at the
Yeah.
same time, I think I want to point out that a lot of the text in the book is exaggerated. I mean, it's true that it reflects Korean society at some level, but at the same time, I think the expressions, the situations, and the environments and everything, like the consequences and everything, they are all exaggerated to some extent. Like she actually wants us to think about what violence means and what it is like to be Yeong-hae and what it would be like to be in that sort of situation. So she has to exaggerate a lot. In that sense, I think it's more than the reality itself.
Right, yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
yeah,
sense. But actually, one thing that I felt was really specifically Korean about this novel was also, I know you always have told me that age is really important in Korean society. And I really noticed that in the book, people's ages were mentioned a lot. So, for example, in one of the last scenes where In-hae's in the psychiatric hospital visiting her sister, every time a character appears, their age is always mentioned right away. So for
yeah,
example, it said a nurse in his late 30s, and then there was a female patient in her 50s, then there was a male patient in his 20s, there
yeah.
was a female patient in her 30s,
Definitely.
there was a middle-aged nurse. Yeah, it was really interesting because I felt like had this book been, written in English, for example, the author
Right.
probably wouldn't have paid so much attention to listing the age of each character.
I don't think it would have been mentioned in the first place if it had been like a English novel.
Yeah, yeah.
I think age is something that's really important in not just in Korean culture, but probably in a lot of Asian cultures as well, because it
Yeah.
dictates like social hierarchies and relationships and everything. And knowing someone's age really helps to establish like the proper way of to communicate and interact with other people, like
Yeah.
whether it's like showing respect or being more comfortable or showing authority and stuff like that. So I guess the emphasis on age might reflect this cultural nuance, like where age shapes how characters interact with each other and relate to one another. So I think that's why age is mentioned a lot in the book, because
Mm.
then you can imagine like in what position this character is in and what kind of power that the character has and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's also interesting, back to what I said before about how In-hae is kind of jealous of Young-hae for being able to kind of not adhere to social constraints, and
Mm-hmm.
she's now left In-hae behind still as a prisoner. It's interesting because like Young-hae is the one who's kind of confined to this mental hospital. Young-hae is kind of the one who's technically in a kind of prison, but even then In-hae still feels that her sister Yeong-hye has found some kind of freedom
Yeah.
by being mentally ill and
Mm-hmm.
being excused from having to
Right.
be kind of a productive member of society, whatever that
Yeah.
means, right?
Yeah. I think that's because for Inhe, like the reality itself is like a prison. Like she cannot escape from it.
Yeah.
Like everyday violence she has to face. Like her husband is a shithole and she now has to take care of a son alone and she has to stay behind to take care of Young-hae and her parents. Like her parents already cut ties with Young-hae, so it's only her in this crazy reality. So automatically she's the one who needs to carry out all the weight of violence and the hardship alone. So I could totally understand and relate to her when she actually says that. Because if she's sick, if she's ill, she can get away from everything.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
But at the same time, I think the genius of the story is how it shows Inhe can also hurt Younghae too. Like she's not just the victim because it also shows that Inhe she doesn't listen and she ends up putting Younghae in the hospital, when Younghae was recovering. So I think it's Han Kang saying that under the right circumstances, or maybe it's more right to say under the wrong situations, anyone can become a perpetrator.
Oh, interesting.
Like, yeah. And the violence itself is deeply human. It's not something limited to a specific role or specific gender. It's a very human experience.
Yeah, what do you think of the violence in this novel and maybe the symbols that are used
Mm-hmm.
for the violence? Because we were saying earlier that there are certain elements of the novel that are very universal,
Yeah.
and you think the violence is one of them. Yeah, do
Yeah.
you want to say
Yeah.
what you think
Yeah.
of it?
I think that's what's really special about this book. Like, this book isn't just about violence against women, it's about violence embedded in humanity itself. Like, this unavoidable, inescapable violence that exists everywhere in the world. Like, for example, we just talked about Inha as well, aside from all the men who are violent. And but at the same time, besides Inhe, it's also interesting to see how Hangang implies that nature can also be violent to human species. Like in the first chapter, there was this line when Younghead does sort of like a monologue to herself, and she says, "The sharp pointed leaves on the trees and my torn feet." So it basically says that Younghae got hurt because of the trees, right? And I think it implies that the trees can also be violent, and the very last line of the book also implies that the trees can be like animals. They are described as massive animals, wild and savage. I think this line says that the trees can be violent. And also, there is this part of the book where Youngha says that she likes her round breasts. And then she goes on and says they are not round anymore, and she's worried about what they can actually do right now, like to harm anyone else. All of it is to say is I think the whole novel is trying to talk about violence. That's an innate part of the human nature, and maybe the whole world or even the nature itself. So Hangang is grappling with this fundamental idea that as long as we exist in this world, violence is unavoidable. No matter where we turn, we cannot escape it. It's so painful. It's such a crazy reality to face, but that's basically our life, our reality. Like we cannot escape it. And I think that's why this book is so powerful and yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
For me, yeah, I think it's so interesting how yeah, what you were saying about how the trees are described as a massive animal, wild and savage. Yeah, I felt that this book really focuses a lot on the animalistic nature
Right.
of both humans, but also like trees and just other
Every living
nature as
things.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, every living thing. Because yeah, there's so many parts where it says that I think it was Yeong-hye let out a roar. She howled like an animal. She bit their arms
Mm-hmm.
savagely. Her voice sounds like the roar of a savage beast. But then even the trees, there's another line which says the woods are a huge animal suppressing a roar. And there's also it kind of reminds me of her other novel, Human Acts, which is very much about violence, the violence that humans can inflict on each other. There's just a lot of kind of blood related images in this book as well. Even when Yong-hae's husband goes to see the art exhibition, it says the deep ox blood curtain fell on the stage. You know, like yeah, even the colors are described in terms of blood. And
Right.
then there's also the image of In-hae's dream where she imagines that there's blood coming out of her eye when she looks in the mirror. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's also the scene where In-hae is like bleeding from her vagina.
Right.
And there's also the scene where the nurse's aide ends up with blood spattered all over her face, which it's actually blood that Yong-hae has vomited
Right.
all over her.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much kind
Oh
of
my God.
emphasis
Yeah.
on the blood
Blood.
everywhere, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So disturbing.
Yeah.
I think in general, like the images and the feels and everything, they are just so powerful and so colorful. Like it's red and it's like blood and like the dog, the world, the trees, like everything is just so powerful.
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, yeah, the book really forces us to confront this reality, the systems that we are part of, the violence we perpetuate, and really makes us question and ask, like, how do we live with this violence? How do we survive it? How do we stop it? Like, can we actually stop it? These are the questions that Vegetarian asks us to think about.
Okay, yeah, so we've just finished discussing The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and now we're just going to end with June reading out her favorite passage from the novel.
Opposite the platform was a row of temporary buildings, their steel structures now decaying, and wild grasses straggling up between the sleepers on the edges over which no trains passed. The feeling that she had never really lived in this world caught her by surprise. It was a fact. She had never lived, even as a child, as far back as she could remember. She had done nothing but endure. She had believed in her own inherent goodness, her humanity, and lived accordingly, never causing anyone harm. Her devotion to doing things the right way had been unflagging. All her success had depended on it, and she would have gone on like that indefinitely. She didn't understand why, but faced with those decaying buildings and straggling grasses, she was nothing but a child who had never lived. Thank you so much for listening to our latest episode, and if you liked that, please share with a friend.
We'd also really appreciate if you could rate and review our podcast. And please get in touch if you have any feedback.
We'll be back again with another episode next week.